Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. The honourable member for Regina-Qu'Appelle.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd just like to indicate at the beginning of my speech that I am splitting my time with my colleague from Edmonton, Wetaskiwin. And as this is my first time rising in the chamber in this parliament, I want to first thank the voters of Regina-Qu'Appelle for once again selecting me to represent them in this chamber. I've had the good fortune to serve in several different roles in the House of Commons. I was Deputy Speaker and Speaker, House Leader for the official opposition, of course, Leader of the opposition. But every time I walk into this chamber, Madam Speaker, I am very aware of the fact that there is no role that I can serve in this House if I don't first earn the trust of the people back home in Regina-Qu'Appelle. So a sincere thank you to everyone who supported me in the last election. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, there is once again a great clash of ideas dividing the world. As Canadians look hopefully to the future about how to emerge from the pandemic and its aftermaths, there are two very distinct versions of what comes next. This clash of ideas and philosophies is basically the same as it has been at several times throughout human history, and especially so in the 20th century. There are those like the Prime Minister and his friends in the global elite who would use COVID as an excuse to expand the size of government. They believe that more government intervention in the economy and more restrictions on individual liberty. And then there are those who understand that it is not government that creates prosperity, it is the free market, people buying and selling freely, that creates wealth and lifts people out of poverty. At essence, it is the age-old debate of whether we should put our faith in government or put our faith in people. It is often said that the best indicator of future results is to look at past results. Well, history is clear on this matter. When we look at the examples where the ideology of government control was put into place, in every country it was tried, it failed miserably. After all, nobody was ever shot trying to get over the wall to get into East Berlin, and nobody ever tried to paddle a raft to get to Cuba. The terms for that ideology changes from time to time. What we once referred to as communism and socialism, those on the left now call their agenda progressive. But changing the name doesn't change the reality. In November, we marked the 32nd anniversary of the Berlin Wall being torn down. Now, throughout the course of human history, walls were generally seen as a good thing. Walls kept you safe. In times of danger, people would run towards the walls to get inside. But that started to change with the rise of socialism. The Berlin Wall was kept to keep people in. Berlin was a real-time experiment in economics and human behavior. In the East, socialism, state control of the economy. Government officials planned what would be produced, by whom, and how much of it. They set wages and prices. They also took away basic human rights like free speech, and they prohibited any criticism of the regime. The result? Misery. Breadlines, shortages, and a stagnant quality of life. In the West, the free market decided. People buying and selling relatively freely set prices, signaled to the market what needed to be produced. The result? Plenty. Huge increases in the quality of life. The difference between life in a free market and life in a society controlled by the government was stark. While the people of East Berlin could not vote in real elections, they could vote with their feet, and they did. There was a steady stream of people fleeing the horrors of socialism. That's why the wall went up, not to keep enemies out, but to keep people in. This is the hallmark of big government intervention into our lives. Those on the left are constantly telling us how wonderful their socialist policies will be. But then they have to go and build walls, sometimes virtual, eliminating our choices, taking away our freedoms to keep people in. When I was first elected in 2004, Canada had its own experiment between free markets and government interference. The difference between Alberta and Saskatchewan throughout the course of Canadian history was also very stark. For decades, Saskatchewan was ruled by the NDP, who adopted that big government interventionist policies. They stifled the free market, drove away private sector investment. And as a result, our province had a long history of economic stagnation and a relatively flat population. In Alberta, there was growth. In Alberta, there was opportunity. When I was fortunate enough to visit Alberta while I was leader, I used to always ask the room how many people in the audience were either from Saskatchewan or had their parents from Saskatchewan originally. And in almost every room across Alberta, when you ask that question, almost half the audience will put up their hand. So I used to like to tell people that the good people of Saskatchewan built 2 great provinces in this country. The language changes, but the policies remain the same. Communism proved to be such an epic failure that its most loyal promoters conceded that it would never be accepted again. But now we're seeing a resurgence of that same type of thinking, that government knows best approach. As we emerge from the aftermath of the pandemic, we can already see the drastic negative impacts of this large expansion into the free market by the government. In March of last year, the Bank of Canada started doing something unprecedented in Canadian history. It started creating money right out of thin air to the tune of $5 billion a week. See, the government had run out of money to borrow from people. And so they had to turn to the central bank to crank up the printing presses to buy the government debt that nobody else was buying. I'm often asked by people back home in Regina-Qu'Appelle, how is the Prime Minister going to pay for his massive deficits? Well, he's not. You are. The Canadian people are. Right now, through inflation. We are paying the cost today in real time as prices continue to go up because the government forced the bank to flood the system with brand new money created right out of thin air. What happens when you have more dollars chasing the same number of goods? Prices go up. We had a decline in economic activity because of the restrictions imposed on our economy because of the COVID pandemic. So not only did we have economic production going down, we had the money supply growing exponentially. Now, governments love inflation. If you go back throughout the course of human history, you'll always find examples when governments spend too much money, they start to devalue the currency. It's a fraud committed on the people who have worked so hard to earn their paychecks, to put a little bit of money away for savings. When the government comes and essentially devalues that work by creating new money. If you think of, if any of my colleagues have ever been to an event where there's a silent auction and there's often a print up for auction, there'll be a beautiful painting and you'll see at the bottom 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 500. Well, that's a limited edition print. It means the artist only created so many of those types of paintings. If you buy that for what you believe the value is, and then that artist goes and creates 5,000 more copies, you've been defrauded. You've purchased something that has had its value stripped away by simply creating more of it. That's what's going on in real time with the money that hardworking Canadians are earning. Now, what can we do to get our economy back on track, Madam Speaker? Well, in the remaining time I have left, I want to make once again a pitch for this government to listen to the concerns of people of Saskatchewan and Alberta and across Western Canada. We have an amazing source of wealth in our country with our oil and gas sector. And we are now living in the completely topsy-turvy world where the first thing that President Biden did upon taking office was cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, something that this government didn't even raise with the incoming president. The Prime Minister canceled Northern Gateway and canceled the Energy East pipeline, which would have taken Western Canadian energy into Eastern Canadian markets. And I see lots and lots of alarmists and radical activists chaining themselves to trees and laying down in front of bulldozers in Western Canada to try to prevent the exportation of our oil and gas. But I never see them lining up and down the St. Lawrence, protesting the tanker after tanker of foreign oil coming into Canadian markets, Madam Speaker. We have an opportunity to provide the world with ethical Canadian energy, and that benefits everyone. Since 2018, Canada's oil and gas production paid almost $240 billion to provincial governments and $66 billion to Ottawa. Conservatives will always be a champion of the hardworking men and women in our energy industry. It's something that the world needs more of, not less of. We can get off of foreign oil coming from brutal dictatorships that have no respect for human rights and get Canadians back to work. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, confess, the government of Canada had to borrow money. We had to borrow money for a very good reason. With the worldwide pandemic, in order to support Canadians and businesses alike, there was a need to be there in a very real and tangible way. Had we not supported them, had we not borrowed the money that the member opposite tries to portray as this bad thing, we would have seen far more bankruptcies. We would have seen many other societal issues, whether it's family breakups to suicides, you name it. The government made the decision to have the backs of Canadians. Is the member saying that we should not have provided those programs that were so critical in helping Canadians through a very difficult time, that being the pandemic?
Member for Regina-Qu'Appelle.
Well, Mr. Speaker, a huge percentage of the deficits that this government has racked up came before the pandemic even hit. They were running $87 billion worth of deficits before COVID-19. During the pandemic, they decided to give $1 billion to their friends in the WE organization, sole source contracts to former Liberal MPs as well. They took the time during a pandemic to make sure that they enriched their friends, Madam Speaker. And let's talk about inflation. The Liberals would like to have us believe that it's some kind of external phenomenon. It's kind of like the weather. Inflation just happens. Well, it doesn't happen in countries that didn't run the printing presses. I could go on and on about billions of dollars in wasteful spending, corporate welfare, $35 billion through the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to bankroll large projects for profitable private companies. The member is going to try to convince Canadians that all of the inflationary spending was related to the COVID-19 pandemic. That is just demonstrably false. When you go through the public accounts and look at where this government spent money, a lot of it is on increased discretionary spending that we've heard throughout the week has actually had the opposite effect of its intention. They've spent more money on housing, got fewer units built, and the price of housing is going up because of it. That's why we need less government intervention in the economy and more free market solutions.
L'honorable député de Shefford.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you. As the critic for the status of women, I would like to congratulate you. I am very pleased to see a woman in your chair. Congratulations, Madam Speaker. My comment for my colleague for Regina-Qu'Appelle. He spoke about the American president's measure regarding Keystone right after he was elected. Well, perhaps that's because the American president understood something that the Conservatives don't seem to have understood, which is that we are at a time when we need to start getting the ecological transition underway, not towards more oil, but towards less. We need to invest in a green recovery, a recovery that will enable us to develop new green technology. That's my comment. My colleague also talked about investments. I'd like to see investments in green technology. And during a period of austerity, we still can't cut in the area of healthcare. That's an area where we need to keep investing. And yet the Conservative government decided to cut our healthcare system during a period of austerity, which is what got us where we are today. Does my colleague not think that it's important for the federal government to reinvest in healthcare up to 35%, just as we should invest in green technology, regardless of the state of the economy after the pandemic? These two sectors will require assistance. The Honourable Member for Regina-Qu'Appelle.
Question very quickly. I have to correct the record. It was the Conservative government that restored the healthcare funding cuts that the previous John Chrétien and Paul Martin government slashed in the 90s. It was the Conservative government that stands up for provincial autonomy and innovation when it comes to the healthcare system, standing up against the Prime Minister's threats to claw back Saskatchewan's healthcare transfers during the election. But the member asked a question about whether or not President Biden understands the global issues around oil and gas. I'll tell the member what I do know. I do know that the president canceled Keystone. He canceled a project that would have brought Western Canadian energy from a safe ally, from a trusted partner, from an ethical source of energy. And then just a few months later, he has to beg OPEC, the President of the United States begging OPEC, countries like Saudi Arabia with terrible human rights records, begging them to supply the United States with more oil and gas. That makes no sense, but those are the types of ideological decisions that the Prime Minister supports, and that's why Conservatives will always stand up for our Western Canadian energy sector.